Meccano part number 48D. Double angle strip, 5.5 inches. Hi folks and welcome back. I'm going to start this script with a disclaimer or maybe a caveat. I'm not 100% sure where these scripts are going to take me. At the time of writing this, I've just completed the third build, the landing module. And as you might have heard in my What's on the Bench update on a Monday morning, I've not overall enjoyed the builds to date. Now, it's not bad Meccano, it's just not grabbed me particularly. So maybe the first thing to look at is what was going on in Meccano's mind at the time, because these sets, in my mind, are not Meccano's finest. There was one event in 1977 that forever changed the toy market, the film by George Lucas, Star Wars: A New Hope. The toy company Kenner produced a range of figures in the 3 3/4 inch scale, a scale that up to that point hadn't been particularly used. Most scales for action figures were either 12-inch Action Man, etc., or 6-inch, used by Bradgate and Palitoy in the Little Big Man range. The first 12 figures, which gave us Luke, Leia, R2-D2, C-3PO, along with Han Solo, Chewbacca, Darth Vader, a Stormtrooper, Obi-Wan Kenobi, a Jawa, an Imperial officer called a Death Squad Commander, and a Tusken Raider. The toys, while constrained in movement, were a complete success. And while limited marketing had been done in the past around TV shows, never had a movie been marketed in this manner before. Star Wars merchandise was on everything. And in frames on the wall in front of my desk is my collection of Star Wars figures, not my childhood ones. They never survived my very destructive pre-teens era. But the ones I had collected as an adult. And yes, I do have a number of the spaceships. And yes, they are hanging from my ceiling using heavy poundage fishing line. The age of electronic toys was coming. In fact, the first ones were here in simple forms. And new tech is always an appealing thing. But somewhere I think Meccano failed to adapt, or just simply dropped the ball completely. Space 2501 and the hyperspace set that followed left engineering behind and opted for a toy to play with. But LEGO had beaten them to the line, releasing the space sets, and they all came a long way behind Kenner when it came to winning the race. Meccano's strength, even today, has always been the intended role that Frank Hornby had envisaged with it. And that is an educational toy to build confidence, engineering skills, and an understanding of what can be achieved when you follow a plan. And that neatly brings us to the plans, or more to the point, the instructions of this set. My greatest complaint throughout these builds, as you will have seen on the What's on the Bench videos, are the instructions. They are just unclear. The use of a photograph of white Meccano on a grey background is not the best thought out option. This was improved on with the hyperspace set at least, where they opted for a coloured background. From the offset, this has put me off visually, and from there I've struggled to enjoy the builds. Coupled with an unprecedented amount of plastic used in the set, along with either poorly designed parts or poorly operating parts, I was left with a feeling of being underwhelmed by the set. And while it's easy to think that all heads were turned to America at this point in history, as the OC-101 had completed its complicated 2-year construction period in 1976, and renamed, it was sat at Edwards Air Base for testing. Now named Enterprise, the first of the space shuttles were here, a reusable spacecraft that would see a change in technology and be the lifting body to a brighter future, a future in space. Science fiction had become science fact. But the space shuttle was no new design. In fact, it was 40 years' work to get to that point. In the late 1930s, two German scientists began work on the Silbervogel project, a liquid propellant rocket-powered suborbital bomber. The two scientists, Jürgen Sanger and Irene Bredet, saw a chance for their design as one of a series of project ideas put forward to Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich during the Second World War for the Meccano bomber. The theorised project was put forward in April of 1942. It stated that the bomber should be able to fly nearly 8,000 miles. The total journey, both outbound to America and return to Europe, or onwards to Imperial-held Japanese territory, carrying 4.5 tons of munitions, as requested by Hermann Göring. The Silbervogel, also known as a Rabo, was first suggested in 1941 in a 900-page proposal put forward to the Ministry of Aviation. The first draft had the range shown as 15,000 miles and a payload of 8,800 pounds, or just under the magical 4.5 tons that Göring wanted. The theory was this: the Silbervogel would take off from a 2-mile-long rail powered by a rocket sledge, with takeoff speed just under Mach 2. After takeoff, the rocket engines would fire, propelling the craft to an altitude of 90 miles at 18 times the speed of sound, around 30 miles beyond the Kármán line, or the boundary between Earth and space, in an area known as the thermosphere. And when we think of thermo, we think of heat. Remember that. Then, like skipping a pebble across a river, the craft would bounce across the atmosphere. With each drag, the flat underbelly of the craft would create lift as the increasing air pressure pushed against it. Like skimming stones, each bounce would create aerodynamic drag, and therefore the next bounce would be a bit shorter. The theory is called boost glide. After reaching the target and dropping the payload, with no hope of any accuracy at all, the Silbervogel would then glide onto Japanese-held territory to be refueled and have its return flight to Germany. Hitler loved the idea when it was offered to him, and the Ministry of Aviation hated it, seeing only a pit of darkness that would swallow vitally needed resources and capital. But then Hitler was a lover of science fiction. He wanted the impossible. He wanted Germany to be the leader of the world when it came to science and engineering. His ways of achieving that were, to say the least, deeply flawed, and we're still having to pay the price today for the effects of that global conflict. But if the Silbervogel had worked, it would have been the first hypersonic aircraft in the world. And it wouldn't have had Maverick to crash it. In fact, Maverick wouldn't have walked away from this one. Sanger and Bredet had got their maths wrong. They'd miscalculated the heat generated by re-entry. The Silbervogel would have burnt up. Secondly, with a payload of around half that of a Lancaster bomber, but a manufacturing cost would have greatly exceeded the former, the return for the investment would have been dubious at best. This is seen time and time again with wonder weapons. They cost a load of money and never do what they say they will. Sanger and Bredet were captured by the French and post-war would work on astronautical engineering projects, and even managed to survive a botched attempt by the USSR to encourage them to work in Russia. When I say encourage them to work, I think the correct word is kidnap, but I could be wrong. The work that Sanger and Bredet did was fundamental for a number of space planes that followed. In the late 1950s, the X-20 Boeing Dynamic Soarer project was created. It was nicknamed the Dinosaur. The role of the spacecraft was that of an aerial reconnaissance, bombing, space rescue, satellite maintenance and space interceptor. I love that. You can just imagine the schoolyard's conversations now. My daddy's a pilot in the Air Force and he flies space interceptors. By 1964 the project was dropped, having spent around $600.5 million on it. In today's money, that's around $6.3 billion. And the dinosaur went the way of the dinosaurs. There was a new kid on the block, the reusable low Earth orbital spacecraft, part of the Space Transportation System, or the STS. The orbital vehicle, known to us as the Space Shuttle, operated for 30 years and had a profound effect on the idea of space being achievable. Science fiction TV shows like Space 1999, broadcast in the 1970s, were now science fact. The eagles from the TV show weren't that much different from the space shuttle that you saw lifting off for real on the TV. But if it hadn't been for the Silbervogel and Sanger and Braddock's work on the Meccano project in the 1940s, movies like James Bond's Moonraker in 1979 and Space Camp in 1986 wouldn't have had the science fact to support the science fiction. And maybe if Adolf Hitler hadn't been so in love with grand ideas placed in front of him, and instead had focused on simpler but workable projects, the end of the Second World War would have been very different. There's a very fine line though with science fiction, and when we cross it, it becomes science fact very quickly. After all, the idea behind Star Trek's communicator is no different to our mobile phone. And the data pads from the Next Generation series are our modern day tablets. And we cross that line without realising it so easily.